So this Café is you titled Gebser in the Present, and as I read forward what you had assigned in the book, it was very relevant to just the term present, but it was interesting. I don't know if you intended it to be so all-encompassing, but the thought that you had was to address some of the questions of how Gebser is relevant today, or in our present day and age, which Gebser cannot participate. He cannot continue writing as he did, and so how is his writing of his era vulnerable to, I think, postmodern criticism? And we noted that, or TJ noted, he's not here, but he asked the question of how Gebser's ideas of something like transparency and time freedom are relevant to what we experience online or in social media. So that was kind of the background of how this conversation formed. And if you don't mind, I'll read a couple of quotes and then allow you to jump in, Jeremy. But
That's great.
On page 294, Gebser, this wasn't part of the assigned reading that you had, but he addresses what the term present means. And he says it's not identical with the moment, but is the undivided presence of yesterday, today, and tomorrow, which in a consciously realized actualization can lead to that presentiation, which encompasses origin as an ineradicable present. But I thought that was a good place to start there. And as a first step, based on your book, Seeing Through the World, I've really dived deep, kind of without realizing it. I've taken some of the references you have in the integral pluralism. I forget how to pronounce that word, but you've mentioned Jeff Vandermeer and Timothy Morton. One of the movies you also referenced is Akira. That was a loose assignment on the side that you've been working on in the background. But as I continue to realize how influential Gebser is, not just for the crew that frequents here at the Café and on Infinite Conversations, the conversation's really been going on for years, since I think Ed has been carrying it around Ever-Present Origin as his second Bible, or as this tome that he references on a day-to-day basis almost. And I found a quote that I'll end with here and pass it over to you, Jeremy, from Michael Purdy in the volume 2, number 1 of Integrative Explorations, in his essay, Gebser's Project, What Must We Do Now? He says, I think the first step, if we are to be true to Gebser, is to start afresh with what he has offered us, and from that starting point to discover what new realms may be waiting. To carry on Gebser's project, we must bring together our own gathered experience and test Gebser's structures, to add to them where they are thin, to replace them where they are found wanting. As scholars of Gebser, we are in a unique position to make sense of this postmodern world. So the 6 of us here, we range from beginner to maybe intermediate practitioners of Gebser, all the way to the Gebsperts. And so this will be an interesting conversation. We've had quite a few conversations about Gebser, or loosely based on Gebser. So I'm really looking forward to where this conversation goes. So thanks for being here, Jeremy.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. I love that word Gebspert. I definitely am stealing that from you guys. Yeah, that's a good quote to open up into. Michael Purdy's statement on the postmodern and how Gebser can perhaps contribute to this state of affairs. that's sort of why I selected those readings. I mean, none of this obviously is like mandatory or anything. It was just recommended. Checking out like chapter 6 from my book, which is summing up the part 2, sort of the eruption of time, and the new mutation chapters from EPO. And then Akira, because I'm doing a class right now called Integral Summer Film Club. And we watch a movie and we talk about it, and I take some bits and pieces from EPO and other texts to kind of meditate on the meaning of the film. So it's just been in mind a lot lately. And I don't know if anybody got a chance to see that, but the themes are all kind of resonant with one another. And in many ways, I think this is sort of an untapped project, something that I just lightly touched on in my book, but hopefully in the next little book, I'm tentatively calling it integral futurism, or fragments of an integral futurism, because I want to really sort of take what Gebser is doing, especially in regards to the phenomenon of time, and relate it to a lot of the literature and commentary that we've had on late capitalism and the phenomena of time in late capitalism, like what Mark Fisher had done in Capitalist Realism, or his ontology in Ghosts of My Life. And is that kind of commentary that I think Gebser fits right into in sort of the present dialogue and discussion around well, like capitalism, technology, modernity, etc. I mean, in many ways, you could kind of superficially see Gebser as a kind of a modernist thinker. He has these grand structures that make up vast swaths of history that everything fits under. You can kind of read that superficially like that. Or on the other hand, you can really kind of get into the nuance of what he's actually saying and the substance of his chapters, and really kind of see EPO as, we throw around this word post-war, right? Being a post-war writer. That means, post World War II and the kind of deconstructive wave that came after that. In some sense, Gebser is doing that and something else as well, because he's so good at critiquing the problems and diagnosing the crisis of modernity. But then on the other hand, he's really interested in sort of articulating the new, right? The new mutation. So in some sense, he can speak to both the postmodern and then whatever we're calling the postmodern, and even assembling it in that kind of linear sense is perhaps no longer appropriate. So that's sort of just the context for what I recommended, because these are all themes that sort of meditate around what we're dealing with right now with the current climate crisis, and what do we do about capitalism, and this sort of growing sense that the entire system, right, there's sort of a meta sense about this, that the entire way that we're relating to the planet and industry and economy and everything is reaching some kind of breakdown, and a whole new way of living is required, and nobody knows how to do that, right? And we also feel kind of powerless that the mechanisms of industrial capitalism are going to just continue to barrel down into catastrophe, as it seems like they are doing. So for me anyway, this time eruption and this crisis of time is just so integral to the current moment. And here is Gebser writing about this, right, in like 1949. But anyway, that's sort of my context for all this, and happy to open it up with you guys and chat.
If you don't mind me, Jeremy, you also I don't know whether it was Doug or you, but talk about the link to the 49th conference on Gebser, which I'm possibly going to go to. I'm looking into it. It's a bit complicated because I have another conference the next week, but in France, but so I may fly from California to France to get to the other conference. But if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between Gebser and Jung in relation to that conference, that would be useful as well.
Yeah, that's also really important. So I'm not the main organizer of that conference, but I think the connections are very interesting. And, first of all, historically and biographically, Gebser knew Jung. They were affiliates or friends or colleagues of some sort. I mean, he was at the Eranos lectures with Jung, and in his personal writings, Gebser mentions Jung and their interactions, and then also, of course, in EPO. So they knew each other. They were in the Arano circles together. So there's this lived context of them knowing each other, which is very interesting. But I think with John Dotson, the kind of emphasis of this upcoming conference is the importance that both Jung and Gebser point to in terms of the crisis of modernity, right? Jung, towards the end of his life, and this is what I'm drawing from it. He had those sort of apocalyptic visions of the end of the world. There's a famous Marie-Louise von Franz interview where she's discussing this, and I haven't actually seen the drawings, but apparently there are also illustrations and writings. Sean Kelly mentions it a little bit in his proposal for the conference, and so there's this weirdly prophetic and prescient nature to Jung's insights on the future as this sort of apocalyptic end time where humanity just barely ekes by a catastrophe. And there's Gebser, who isn't really looking so much at the catastrophic, but throughout EPO, he has this kind of direness about the urgency of the integral mutation, right? And how if we don't enact it consciously, the consequences of that could be catastrophic, and that we would have to go through essentially a dark age. So to me, it's this idea of, well, the emergency and emergence, it's Dotson's wordplay there, and then a dissolution solution, which is Gebser's wordplay, and then Jung's concept of, well, what do we do then? Like, how do we avoid the worst of the catastrophe? In my abstract that I'm working on, I'm playing a little bit with what Gebser talks about with retracting the technological projections, and what Jung talks about with taking back the opposites. And I think there's a similarity there. I'm not saying they're the same, but I think there's something similar that both Gebser and Jung are saying in terms of how do we deal with the crisis, which feels very environmental and systemic and enveloping. How do we kind of see through the crisis into our own consciousness? I think, Jung is famous for saying mankind is the danger, right? And whenever Gebser talks about this crisis of modernity and technology, he's always pointing it back. He's always kind of going like, we need to trace the technology back to the structure of consciousness that produced it and retract it. So there's this kind of remediation, I think, that Gebser's pointing to, and Jung, that might have connection.
I was wondering, because it was mentioned, what would postmodernism, how would they critique Gebser? I wasn't, it was mentioned, but I didn't understand what critique they could have on him.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody else wants to talk about that. I think it's, like I was mentioning, the grand narrative thing, archaic, magic, mythic, mental, integral, just phrasing things, structuring things in that way, and that kind of sweeping grand narrative of history, which is not exactly what Gebser's doing, but still he's playing with these big structures and just the very notion of these structures of consciousness that unfold in history sounds very modernist, right, or very Hegelian. So I think there could be a very ready-made instinctive critique that postmodern academia would readily throw at Gebser. And this is something I've encountered too when I've been thinking about going back to graduate school for a PhD, and sort of like comparing and contrasting the programs, the ones that are more mainstream, I couldn't just go and be like, okay, I'm going to further Gebser's integral pedagogy or something. I'd have to situate him as this sort of historical figure who's playing with an idea that was popular, this concept of integrality in these sort of unique countercultures or historical communities. I have to frame it like that and not be able to talk openly about structures of consciousness as a plausible idea in mainstream academia. So I think that's sort of what any of these sort of bigger picture thinkers have to deal with, is sort of translating these bigger ideas that aren't very minute in particular into historical context, et cetera, I'm hoping that's starting to change, though, and I get the sense it is starting to change in different ways. I think there's a new sensibility that's emerging that a lot of folks are talking about. But anyway, that's like the one that stands out for me. It's just using these grand ideas about history, and how easily that could be, just sort of attacked, and very readily with plenty of ammunition. But I don't think those things hold up, when you actually look at Gebser and what he's doing. So I think he has an interesting response to that.
That's interesting, because I was listening to a podcast with Vince Horn and the lady that wrote, Anne Gligg, that wrote American Dharma, and their conversation, it was titled Sameness and Differences. And difference, and he actually touched on this that you're pointing to, that of where he's at, of just maybe, I'm not sure if I'm going to language this right, but it felt like it's not about doing away with the big narratives, just to hold them more lightly and be open to, because we need something to move forward. We need something larger than the catastrophe that we're witnessing. So I like the way he nuances of coming to a better, how we work with those, rather than so driven around power, I guess, because that's the critique of postmodernism, right? Is how those structures become power orientated so much, if I understand that right.
Yeah, there's I think there's sort of an emphasis on sort of the construction of meaning and influence and power is a sort of in some ways it's actually kind of a-perspectival, a lot of postmodern thinking, because it's looking at how all of these different flows of power dynamics and the construction of meaning are all kind of woven together. It can be seen and read very a-perspectively. It's just sort of emphasizing, I think, a lot more of the secular, and it's sort of, and again, like, this is sort of interesting because this comes up with like Ken Wilber's work too in integral theory, this idea that, a lot of these conceptual works or intellectual movements are combinations of both the perspectival and a-perspectival, and that like they're symptomatic of the decline of the perspectival age. Like, postmodern theory, generally speaking, is very deconstructive as well, as it is opening up this new contextual landscape of these different flows, which can be very, very kind of, it's really kind of a metanoia. It's a new way of seeing things. But then on the other hand, the emphasis on deconstruction is very perspectival. It's all about ratio and making the cut and cultural fragmentation and those, and identitarian, emphasis. So it's sort of expressing both. It's not an either or, right? It's sort of this overlay between the two. And I see the same thing with Wilber, but I think Wilber's doing something a little bit different. Rather than emphasizing the deconstruction, he's sort of trying to bring back the perspectival efficiency of the sort of grand narrative, right, to capture the integral. And kind of say, well, if we temper the grand narratives and if we only let the good ones in, right, then we can move forward with the project of modernity and bring back progress and bring back big picture thinking with some, a little bit of hand slapping from the postmodern critiques. And so I think he's sort of doing something similar in that he's sort of re-expressing the mental to try to do the integral. So he's also very Janus faced, but just with different emphasis. And again, like one of the things that Gebser brings up too, which is kind of like his own PreTrans fallacy, his version of that critique, is this idea that, the old kind of dresses up like the new and we sort of mistake it for the new again. So I think, Wilber might be making a similar kind of mistake in the sense that he's sort of resurrecting the perspectival and the mental and thinking it's the integral because it has this new energy to it, the same way that we can do a kind of a regression in the magic and the mythic and mistake that as the integral as well, because it's been repressed. And now the mental has been sort of deconstructed and repressed, at least that dimension of it. So it's complicated. There's no, I don't think there's really any straightforward answer with any of this stuff.
Thank you, Jeremy. I appreciate your input.
I'd like to add something to that. It's a little over my head some of this, but you mentioned the PreTrans fallacy, which Wilber was famous for. And I think you mentioned that there's something about that PreTrans fallacy that is also, there's a caution that I think is, we should respect Wilber's intent, but there's also a tendency to, in a way, repeat the flawed kind of thinking that puts boundaries that are very much like circles around magic, mythical, mental, archaic. When we know from our study that these boundaries are extremely permeable, and they're all co-present. The magical, the mythical, the mental are all happening right now in each of us and all of us and in between us. So I think you also mentioned punctuated equilibria. That's sometimes more like what I think the Perspectival is than Wilber's transcend and include. That we make a frame, we break the frame, we transframe. I think this is what Nora Bateson is talking about. She doesn't exactly talk about it this way, but I think she talks about symaphosy as a way of these cognitive silos that we built in academia are no longer adequate to deal with the real world's problems that we're facing. And so I think the postmodern is late modern rather than postmodern. This is my take on, we're in a transition, and we're a little bit of both, and we're also neither. And I think that's we see healthy forms of healthy or efficient and deficient forms of the mental all over the place. And when people are often stuck, it's because, and I think that's a very healthy sign when they can acknowledge that they're stuck, because they're usually in that in-between, that liminal zone between a structure that is inadequate for what's happening in the world around them. So, and I think the postmodern was very sensitive to the universalizing tendency. This is universal. And who says that? We say so. We who are in power say this is universal. And if you don't agree with us, then you are deviant. So I think that's the challenge, is who decides who is deviant? And because the deviant is not deviant to the deviant. It's only those who have an alternative universalization that can then call upon and actually act upon persons they deem deviant. And we have too many history, we have too much evidence of this. The people calling their bias universal. And I think this is why I was trying to queer a Bible story, Jonathan and David and Saul in Samuel, which I did, I think, a few sessions back, or maybe the session where we were talking about your book. And I think this is a very postmodern, a healthy postmodern tendency, is to go back into our shared history and look at texts and add something to them that is latent, but that was not potentiated fully or actualized on a large scale in that particular culture. And I do believe there's a love story going on between Jonathan and David, and it's not that hard to find. It's pretty much on the surface of the text. And that Saul, the conflict between Saul and David and Jonathan, as I queer this text, is a love story gone wrong. And a potential was not expressed or actualized. But I think that the latency in these previous structures can become available to us, and in very interesting ways. As we go back to texts which are in the public domain, pretty easy to do with the Bible. But I think we're getting new texts emerging out of the past, that things are becoming available to us. I'm reading about the Dervini manuscript, the oldest book discovered. It's papyri, I think you call it. But it was preserved in this tomb. And this was right in the Axial Age, which we're studying now, some of this. I think it's in the 500 BCE. But I think I'm not quite sure about the date, but it came right in the middle of, right around the time that Socrates was forced to drink hemlock. There was this text, and you know what it's about? Literary theory. It's a very convoluted text. We don't know who the author was, but he's really juxtaposing different debates about the nature of allegory, reality, symbolism, metaphor, analogy, all of that stuff. And there is some belief now that Socrates died in the middle of a very big culture war that was happening in Athens. Now, this is something extremely interesting that you wouldn't get from just reading Plato, because there's a lot that's underneath Plato and underneath Aristotle. And we get a lot of their texts, and that's underneath Euripides and underneath Sophocles. We don't have all the plays. We have 30 of them out of thousands of plays that were produced during this time. So we got little bitty fragments, but I think when these new discoveries happened, it's very illuminating. And also, and then I'll shut up because I'm probably talking too long, but Herculaneum, which was the town, the seaside town that was destroyed, and it was right next to Pompeii during that big explosion. I understand that the library at Herculaneum, which was owned by one of Julius Caesar's relatives, had a huge library, and they found, and it was all on papyrus, and they're all scrolls, and they were covered in, lava, but they were preserved, and they slowly, and this was like 150 years ago they were discovered, maybe. And they're slowly learning how they can pull them apart, and they were unreadable to the human naked eye, but they've discovered surveillance technology that's been used on satellites to look at what's on the ground from a great distance, that same technology can be used to read these scrolls. And what is to the naked eye, you can't see anything, all of a sudden is illuminated through this technology. So you can actually read the script, and they're able to, now after 150 years of discovering these texts, they're able to start translating them fairly quickly. And so we'll get an inside scoop on what the Romans, certainly the elite, were thinking about, and what they were writing about, and what they were reading, in ways that was, not possible. So these are the kind of things that I think are fascinating about the times that we're living in, and this interplay between technology and the imagination, and the world of reading and writing, and the articulation of the symbolic. And so I hope that's of use to this conversation. Oh, and by the way, I'm only read the last chapter of your book, Jeremy, and I've read part of chapter 3. I just got the book yesterday, but it's a very illuminating read. I'm enjoying it thoroughly, and I'm looking forward to checking out all your footnotes. Thank you.
Awesome, John.
Keep me busy for a long time.
That's great. I just want to quickly say before anybody else jumps in, I think that's your first point about like reading a new history in the Bible stories and the mythology. I just keep thinking of like what William Irwin Thompson does when he's looking at these ancient fairy tales or folklore, and he's able to read in it something that we only know now in terms of an interpretive narrative, like the Rapunzel folktale, and how that works with the whole cyanobacteria revolution and evolution of life on Earth, and how, I forget the other bacteria, but one usurps the other, and the world of oxygen producing plants sort of creates this evolutionary catastrophe, and he sort of is reading this into all these folk tales and fairy tales, particularly in that one tale of Rapunzel and the Rapunzel flower. And Weird Studies did an episode on Nick Land's concept of hyperstition, and it's a sort of idea that within one creative narrative or story or myth, and the very act of myth making, there is just sort of an infinite, not just an infinite interpretation, but the entire universe, in a sense, kind of wrapped up in any kind of creative act. So you can kind of go back and continue to participate with what's been written in the past. It's not that the past is a static thing with one message that's been written once. It's that any of our narratives have this sort of interpretive, creative nexus that can always be generative, depending on where we're at and how we are reading the text. So just made me think of that. And of course, everything Gebser does in EPO as well, with the myth memes and how he's reading these myths and how he's reading the Greek myths to talk about the structures of consciousness and how you can still clearly see them going on there. So I think there's definitely something to this. And even thinking about text and literature and history in this way, it's no longer linear. We're participating in the creativity of the past, and it's participating in the present. So even this is a very aperspectival just style of understanding what myth is, what the Bible is, what our history is. So that's just another great example, I think, of how the style of thinking is sort of, it doesn't even need Gebser to call it aperspectival. It just sort of, it is. And as, Thompson always talks about, it's like we want things to be more descriptive and less prescriptive in terms of, here's the totalizing theory, how does everything fit into that? And it's more like, how do I listen to what's going on and try to give a name and a language for it that's more related to the processes themselves, like sympathesy and warm data, et cetera. So there's a style in thinking that is sort of becoming more prevalent no matter where we're looking, in my opinion anyway. So I really like that you spoke to that.
I think that's a very important point you just made, Jeremy, that we're starting to look at things differently than we did. We necessarily have to, on the one hand, but we always start with where we are. So if I'm a very rationally oriented scholar who needs to break that, we had this discussion in the Axial Age group. If I'm a scholar that breaks everything down and conceptualizes everything and tries to lay out an argument, then it's difficult. I know something's wrong somewhere. It shouldn't be this way. I've got this all laid out, but I don't know what to do with it because how I've been trained or how I've been educated and all I've gone through and how I've worked for the last 40 years as a scholar is standing there, and I can't get any further. And there's a kind of an innate sense of helplessness that shows up there. And at the same time, it's like you mentioned, well, you can look out into the world and everything's broken. Nothing's really working the way it's supposed to. Our economic theories don't really accurately describe the catastrophes that we're seeing, or why is the next crash going to come? When is it going to come? But we all know it's going to come because it has to come at some point, but nobody can explain or predict when it's going to be. So all of the things that we've developed that we've relied on don't really work. And now we have to deal with these things in a way that we're not equipped to deal with them. And in that, and that's, I think it's an important point that you made, within that come these incipient insights that are like integral, a perspectival. I think it's over there somewhere kind of thing. Of course, the next person comes along and says, oh, you can't be doing that at all. But the evidence amasses because we do things like reinterpreting text. I found that I'm not reading the Paradise Lost, it's a theory thing, but I found the last discussion because of the Paradise Lost, one of the participants said, well, why would you interpret Satan like that? And my reaction was, well, why wouldn't you? Because you can. You can do it, and it's a very convincing, I don't have to agree with it, but it can be a very consistent, and it can be a very enlightening and a very illuminating interpretation. And this person over here is looking at it also from a different perspective, and he's going down maybe one path, but I have the advantage of where I am in my current day and age that I can see 3, 4, 5 laser beams pointing at something, and I can start looking and comparing and contrasting and doing what I think I need to do in order to come to terms with that variety that is there, because I can see it as destructive or enriching. And that possibility is also there. So I can start incorporating things from these in order to gain my own understanding of those, because somehow I think all of these stories that we tell all kind of have the same root somewhere. This is what I get from Thompson. I love that Rapunzel thing. Is we call it lamb's lettuce here in Germany. It's actually my favorite salad. So we have it a lot in this house. It's in this house a lot, and every time it's on the table, of course, the 4-year-old gets pieces out of the fairy tale that's related to the lamb's lettuce kind of thing. And because I think that's where you start. You kind of start with the fairy tale, and I've got this thing here, and what is it? And then you go on, and maybe you become a biologist, and maybe you realize that there are medicinal properties in there. Maybe you realize these other things that we don't really think about when we engage them. But then someone like Thompson comes along and says, "Oh, by the way, this is very much like." And I love the parallelism that gets built up across these disciplines, where we're all kind of doing it in our silos, but some of us are freer to jump from one silo to the other. You're confronted with the dilemma of, okay, where do I sneak through the silo, or how can I get them to maybe open a window into somewhere? It'll be a challenge, I'm sure, but if anybody's going to solve it, I'm sure that you will. But it's that we're in the position. John's example with the text, we can now illuminate. There is actually still text there. We thought it was gone, but it's there. Now we can do something with it. Now we can start looking at it. And why wouldn't we interpret it in a variety of different ways? There's also the way of looking at how it was written in the context that it was written in. That's also a valid one. And I certainly think somebody will and probably should explore that and bring that out, because that adds another dimension to our multidimensional looking at whatever it is that it is looking at, because we're not sure what it's actually looking at. That to me is the mystery and the most fascinating aspect. What's all of this pointing at? And well, maybe we'll figure that out a little better as time goes on.
Yeah, there's a general sense of a general attitude, a general aperspectival attitude that I would say is sort of creeping up everywhere. And it's this feeling, it's how you described it. It's things seem to be interrelated with one another, like in that concept of hyperstition or the Rapunzel myth. We don't know how or why. It's not like we can overlay it now with, well, okay, let's create a theory and create a capstone on reality to explain why that's happening. We just know that, and as a kind of embodied felt sense, that things are interrelated with other things. And that sounds very magical in terms of Gebser's structure, magical, not as a pejorative, but it also sounds very aperspectival. And I think there's resonance with the aperspectival and the integral and the magical in this sense of the simultaneity and interrelatability of all these things, of large grand narratives and tiny, microcosms. It's not something we can create an easy totalizing theory about. And that seems to be the big difference, that, mythical and magical structures were kind of participating in that naturally. The mental kind of abstracted it, but the abstraction, as useful as it is, it can't capture it, So they're just always kind of relating and opening back up to what the magic and the mythic are just sort of participating in. And I'm thinking of Owen Barfield a little bit at this moment, just because I'm checking out that Mark Vernon book right now on the evolution of Christianity through Barfield. And but it's this idea that, okay, well, we used to be able to relate to things in this way. We may not have been able to abstract them. We've abstracted things. That doesn't really work as a kind of a final answer. So now we're kind of opening back up to relating to things, to things like hyperstition, the things like simultaneity, the interconnectivity of one idea and myth, and then sort of what's going on with the planet as a whole, back into the microcosm. It's just an attitude. There's a kind of a style of movement, of thinking, of relating, of sort of being situated in these constant flows of inaction, like en, right? So we're constantly enacting things and generating things and interpreting with things. So there's a kind of a withness of being right now. And that's sort of opening up these different vistas. And this is just where we are. You know, I mean, we can call it a perspectival. We could call it, I don't even know. Maria Popova talks about combinatorial creativity as sort of a style of thinking that the internet age engenders. I think that's a good way to put it. But I think it's good to come back to why it's a little different from the mental, which is that, again, there's no totalizing static narrative for this. There's just that palpable sense of interacting with everything all at once right here and attempting to creatively participate in that, and also knowing that any kind of totalizing narrative that we make up will be temporary. It'll just be kind of like a placeholder that easily falls apart. And Gebser even talks about that. You know, it's like a photograph of time. It's just a snapshot, and it just the moment after is already different. So no static theory can hold reality. And I think we're starting to get used to that as beings who are very situated in the mental and are having to learn new styles of thinking. Again, if we call it integral or a perspectival or who knows, complexity thinking, but it's definitely this new kind of felt sense and felt style of relating to the world. And I think that's important. But yeah.
As I was listening to everybody and stuff, how would Gebser, or because I'm just getting into EPO, there seems to be how the myth or these different structures are interacting with the actual biological need for homeostasis. You know, it's like Anthony Damasio wrote a book, The Strange Order of Things, and he's using the biological homeostasis as a beginning to start seeing patterns when you become a nervous system, and some of this feels like, when in the descriptions, like that's what we're encountering is the edge of our, not to say we're just, you know, biological, but our biological kind of, we're kind of grounded in it in a sense, you know, and that edge of constantly maybe stretching the boundaries of that homeostasis equilibrium. And these different structures are kind of expanding that. It feels like to me. This is just something I'm riffing off, trying to, you know, listen to what I'm hearing.
I'm thinking of James Lovelock, actually, as you talk about that, because that's sort of the idea behind Gaia Hypothesis is that there are homeostatic self-regulating processes that are going on that seem to be happening at the macro scale. And isn't that interesting? Not that we can understand that quite yet, but that there seems to be a tendency of complex systems to move in these holes. So again, it's like we can't see the elephant, but we know that there's an elephant and it's a living thing. And we can't cage it. We're just along for the ride. So it's like, how do we live with the thing that's moving that is the whole?
And get out of the way. You don't want to get trampled by it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm just going to leap in there. The homeostasis and homeodynamics. I think there's something that wants you to stay the same. And that's good, because 1 degree of temperature, you can go from health to disease really fast. So you want to keep the range of temperature that our equilibrium is maintained by these delicate capacities our biology has to monitor us. So, but then there's those dynamic situations that demand that you change. And I think these are those liminal zones we often go into, or those trance states, or those discontinuities, punctuated equilibrium. I think it was Stephen Gould and Richard Lewontin said that evolution doesn't happen slowly and incrementally, but suddenly. Evolution happens very fast. So you can have everything's going along just perfectly well, and all of a sudden the system crashes and something else happens. happens that no one could have predicted. And I think this is the shift from what Lewontin and Gould are calling punctuated equilibrium, which is sort of different from that idea of there's a long learning curve and we just pick out the best things for us. And then another learning curve happens and we pick out the best of that. No, it's much more like everything is working fine and then it crashes. Herculaneum and Pompeii were thriving cities, wonderful, magical places. Then all of a sudden, Vesuvius blew up and covered both of them in ash. Many of the persons died and libraries were buried. It wasn't the end of the world, that's for sure. The ancient world still muddled on through, but there was a big chunk of that history that had been lost, but now we are rediscovering it through modern technology. Some of it, we're getting a glimpse into the interiors of those people in a way that we could not from just looking at their charred bodies as they ran away from the lava. So I think that's what's interesting. But I also think that Thompson, I think is a real good example. I was listening to the Lindisfarne tapes, which I think you referenced in one of your footnotes. And this was in 1975 when Lindisfarne, which was a fascinating experiment, social experiment, he's giving a talk. And about half an hour into the talk, someone blows up and he gets a heckler who really is pissed off. And he says, all you've done is tell one story after another. Where's the logical argument here? And Bateson gets pissed off too. And he says, you're not gonna get that from me. You know, I work analogically. I go from story to story to story. There are overlaps. If you can listen, some people can't. And I think you may be one of them, but I think we should let me finish this. And at the end of this, we can then work with a rational mind, which is pretty fucking slow, let's face it. You know, it wants those rational arguments lined up, and then it wants to reach a conclusion. So I think but we all have rational minds that want to keep it simple, and we all have these nonlinear phase spaces we enter into, which inform us that it is not that simple. And we have to sort of find that balance, each person, I think. And I think it's becoming critical now because we just have so much more information at our fingertips than we have ever had before. And I fear, my own experience, almost very, very little of it gets integrated. So I think unless enough of us are grounded enough, we just may blow a fuse. And I think that's happening on a grand scale. And I think you can hear it in the language that people use. I remember George Steiner, the great literary critic, he said that I think he was actually a child in Germany during Hitler. And he said you could feel it, the language was dying. The more you heard Hitler talk and the more people started to replicate his mental garbage, the language started to die. I don't think you have to look very far in our current circumstances to find dead language that dominates us. I mean, just look at CNN or the NewsHour. I mean, these are zombies talking, and there's nothing alive. It's all pre-scripted and it's pretty dead, and they're out to sell you something, usually an agenda or some policy, and everything is trapped in these rigid binaries. And the interviewers and the politicians have both coordinated their behavior in the way that's going to turn out nothing remotely novel or new or innovative. So these are, excuse me if I'm descended into rant, but I do think we're in that, and it's very fragile, and I think it's wonderful that we have come together, Jeremy and Doug and Ed and Michael and all of us here together to create a space where we can start to take a meta perspective on our own language and our own behavior and gesture, and it could be a drawing, it could be a podcast, it could be a movie we've all seen and we talk about that, or giving our attention to a book, because I think this is character and culture and community co-arise, and so that we can handle the perturbations that are coming at us. Otherwise, they'll just blow us to pieces. And so this is, I think, part of our survival, as well as the pleasure. There's an aesthetic pleasure that happens when we get together and tell stories or anecdotes or try to work out a complex theory of human nature. So thanks a lot.
One of the things that kind of gave me a different perspective on Wilber was reading Winnicott, the child psychologist, where he talks about, in terms of children and their development, that that integration, the opposite of integration, is not disintegration, it's unintegration, which I feel this kind of plays. I'm spinning it in here. That's why we do need to slow down and listen to each other and do what John's saying and Jeremy, you put forth. Because one of the things to put it grossly, one of the times I got tired of Wilber, even though he seemed to kind of on the side be not saying this, but it still felt like, well, the rational trying to force us into integration, which I don't think that's the way it works. It doesn't feel to me, coming out of my trauma, the best way I healed is when I slowed down and be okay with waiting for whatever's healing can come on. But I still had to do practices, I had to breathe right. I had to, take care of my body and stuff. But the mental anxiety, I guess, is hurry up and get whole. I had to leave behind. So I just want to add that into the mix.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. But what I'm thinking of is James Bridle's book, The New Dark Age. And I talk about it a little bit in my book, but he's got some interesting perspectives. And one of the things that comes up a lot in his interviews is this idea that the information age ended up, in a sense, creating this catastrophe of too much knowledge and too much information, and sort of worked counter to the notion, the very futurist modernism notion, right? That more information and infinite information accessible at our fingertips is somehow going to create an enlightened age where the whole world is illumined and we have access to everything and everything makes sense. And we can now enter this new, ultra rationalist, space utopia or whatever, we were thinking about back then when computers were coming online for the first time, literally. Instead, we've had this kind of flood, right? There's that other book called The Flood, right? About information too. And we've lost that stable perspectival ground that information and algorithms and data was supposed to present for us. So in some sense, there's a general understanding that the world that the computation has wrought is actually kind of counter to the utopian sense of what modernity was looking for in terms of information equaling enlightenment. We don't know how to relate to it. We don't know how to process it. We don't know how to slow down. We only know how to quantitatively, exponentially increase it. So it becomes a flood. And what happens when that happens is we get, flat earthers and this sort of, cultural fragmentation and some of the issues that the perspectival world is really good at and was efficient at, which is generating this totalizing sense of reality and cutting a piece of the whole, making that ratio cut, and grounding ourselves in this new abstraction, which creates, which has helped found the modern world. Now we're sort of taking that to an exponential level. So everybody's doing it. Now there's no more ground. Ironically, if you push the ground, everyone making their own ground, then there's no more ground. It's like McLuhan says, when you take something and push it to its extreme, it becomes its opposite. It becomes something else. And so we kind of reached the sound barrier. And information has become a dark age rather than an age of enlightenment. So I think it's very interesting, and it's certainly it's one of those cases where we can really kind of see the deficiency of the perspectival really kind of just laid bare. And then that raises the question, though, what John was saying about how do we navigate that and not become drowned in it? A very mythical sense of the flood again. Well, clearly it's not just to reify the mental and assume that that's going to help us stand on water like Christ. I think the somehow there has to be a diaphanous quality to the answer to this crisis. And I don't know what that looks like. But it's not simply reifying the mental anymore, however that emerges. It certainly helps to be present, as John was saying, and realizing how inactive and co-arising that we are with the culture and the knowledge that we produce. So not really an answer, but I think it lays bare some of the issues and the crisis we're dealing with today, and how it connects with what Gebser was saying in 1949.
So I haven't said much so far, mostly because I'm still struggling with a number of things. So I'm not a Gebspert. I'm sort of in that intermediate, I would say lower intermediate stage. I mean, I've read most of EPO, but I need to reread chunks of it. So, I mean, when I first encountered this idea of perspectival, I sort of said, oh yeah, well, that's obvious. You know, I mean, I'm a spatial guy. My whole career has been around dealing with things spatially, and spatially is kind of perspectival, or there's a way of thinking about space as perspectival. And I do think that the awareness of space has grown exponentially in the world, that people generally have a fairly good understanding of space now, and integrate a certain kind of perspectival in the spatial context, in the spatial way. But reading this chapter 6 and its discussion of the time issues in Gebser. Now, Gebser's a treatment of time, I still don't really get my head around it. Even though I'm a physicist and I think part of his ideas are actually grounded in modern physics, I still don't fully understand the temporal aspect of what he's talking about. And I'm still struggling with that. And I think maybe it's more a question, I guess I have, is because there's a way where the aperspectival in the spatial context moves into this. It's not exactly aperspectivity in the temporal context. It's something a little bit different, or it's a manifestation that comes to it. You know, it's almost he talks about the freedom of time, and you talk about that, Jeremy, but there's also a compression of time that we're talking about. You talk about this idea of a temporal catastrophe kind of idea. And obviously that's the kind of situation that we are in worldwide right now in terms of the crisis that we're dealing with. But understanding these issues where I'm, and I think my perplexity is not just my perplexity. I think it's a general perplexity. I don't think anybody or large numbers of people really understand the temporal aspects of the issues and how to confront and manage these parts of the issues. I think that they get the spatial aspects, but not so much the temporal. Even the entanglement issues that I've been looking at. You explain entanglement, everybody kind of gets it, but they think of it spatially because the experiments are worked out in a kind of spatial way. But it's the temporal aspects of entanglement that are the really strong aspects of what's going on. It doesn't just entangle space, it entangles time. And the entanglements in time are harder to understand, harder to even figure out how you would actually use that modify the way we think about the world. So I don't have any sharp question for you, but it's kind of another way of slowing down the discussion, if you like, with my perplexity.
Speaking of time, though, right? Yeah, I don't know. Maybe Ed, if you want to jump in here too to sort of explore this. with me. My only comment right now is that
I found Jeffrey's non-question, the real encapsulation of what's at issue here. You know, because we focus on the, I don't, you know, not to preempt anything, but we do focus on that spatiality because we can deal with it. That was precisely my point in the axial age discussion. It was all spatially laid out and we could do that, but they sense there's something else at work here and I don't know how to deal with that. And that's the part where people trip up. That's where they find, let's say, finding that the window, the exit, the escape hatch, or whatever it is to get beyond where they are, is probably temporal in some sense. It's on the time side of it, and we really have trouble getting our heads wrapped around that. And that, I think that's one of Gebser's main points. What he says at one point, kind of very flat out, what we did with space is what we need to do with time. And everybody goes, okay, and they're like, well, what's that? Because that is the key issue. And I found Jeffrey's formulation of that actually very, very poignant, because that's really what it is. It's about in the end, you know, getting the term. That was just my interjection. You know?
Yeah, getting to the heart of it, I think Jeffrey's doing for us. It's the question is that, I mean, he even says this elsewhere in EPO, that time is the quintessence, is the fundamental function of the aperspectival. What the hell does that mean? What does that actually mean? And then also that time is not an abstraction. You know, if you spatialize something, you're abstracting it in the sense of kind of placing things in a spatial grid or layout with different relationality. You can visualize it, but he's saying time is this. It's more than that. So what does that mean? One of the things, though, I think is this is more of a poetic answer, and maybe more of a kind of a individual's phenomenology, their own sense, their own felt sense answer. But one of the things Gebser does bring up quite a bit is one of the helpful precursors to the concretion of time, as he calls it, this realization of the time aspect, is getting a felt sense of the magical and the mythical, because at least those can get us out a little bit of the mental spatialization again. And he mentioned this, reiterates this as a kind of, it comes up quite a bit, that if you can somehow resuscitate and concretize the magic and the mythic as a felt sense in yourself, in your experience of time and space, then that can help you along, because it dislodges you from the mental a little bit. And then the very fact of being now in this interim space, this felt sense of kind of stepping out of the mental a little bit and being in the magic, and then being in the mythic, being in the mental again, being able to go in between those, gives you this little bit of a hint of what that freedom is that he's talking about with the aperspectival sense of time. And I think that's at least a place for us to start, you know, because we can find those examples in our lives a little bit more concretely than what the hell does he mean by time freedom, right? So that might be a precursor, and I think he was right to describe it and reiterate its importance. Because, you know, otherwise it's sort of, well, we did the magic and the mythic, let's not resuscitate that, let's just keep going forward. But what's weird with this time phenomenon is that, you know, the magic and the mythic all of a sudden they are, as you're saying, Jeffrey, they get entangled. And so an exploration of the integral consciousness, I don't think that can be really separated from the magic and the mythical coming back up and being kind of accommodated, you know, and faced with and confronted. And very often with a vengeance, because those things have been so repressed or dislocated or cut off by the mental and being very modern beings. So it's not exactly an answer either to your question, but I think that's one of the suggestions Gebser provides, and I think it's useful. The other one, I love that you brought it up, that the time is so important to really understanding entanglement, and that's the real implication of it. How time is entangled. Going back to Doug's first quote, right, from EPO about the present is not identical with the now, but it's yesterday and today and tomorrow. How is that? I guess the question, which is maybe an unanswerable question, is how do we create or generate or encounter a felt sense of that as individuals? How can we make this concrete in ourselves? I don't know. Besides presence, besides reading Dogen maybe, and wondering maybe he did with Uji, time being.
I wanted to respond by quoting from you, but Doug, did you have anything to share? Did you want to say something, Doug?
I would just confuse the matter even more by introducing my version of spatial thoughts that I have in concept with time, but that's something for another day, or perhaps later in this discussion. So go ahead, John.
Thank you. I'm quoting from Jeremy. This is somewhere in chapter 4, I think, which I was reading before the call, and I like this paragraph. I think you're talking about systasis and dealing with a proper arrangement of intensities. This is the quote. This means that our expressions of the evolution of consciousness in the varied maps, models, and conceptual schematics in the field of consciousness studies all inherit the challenges of not only describing emergence and becoming in an aperspectival mode, but being integral themselves. Can emergence be expressed without linearity? Or rather, can a perspectival and categorical theory of consciousness itself express the quintessence of time? Breaking through into a new reality is no easy task. These leaps of flight take risk and possibility of failure. And so new forms of statement typically have their Janus-faced beginnings. Like the shift from mythic to mental consciousness, the nascent integral age will be full of many interesting and wonderful articulations that mix the old and the new. And finally, you say a leap from mental into the integral will truly be a leap out of our familiar world. In the dissolution of the deficient mental structure, the solution of the efficient integral, the new mutation is often a complete departure, another plateau. I'm sorry for the siren going down the street. It's also starting to rain very, very quickly. I'm going to close my window. I'll be right back. Okay, now I just want to add something to this great quotation. And I'm really curious about dissociation, and it can be traumatic and it can be pathological, but not necessarily. And I think we sometimes really get confused about this. So, because where do you go when you go to sleep at night? Where do you go when you go into a trance? Where do you go when you are reading a story and all of a sudden you're not aware of your surroundings? So your partner may be saying, what do you want for dinner tonight? And you don't hear that person because you're so immersed in this story. So I think those are healthy forms of dissociation because there's a decoupling of the here and the now with something else. It's quite mysterious. And I think we need to, I think you said this, by knowing the old, Jeremy, you're talking about the old and the new. By knowing the old, I actually mean something like reconstituting it. Produce it in yourself in the present. And my question was, with what? And I responded with the third ear and the third eye. And this reminds me of a dream I had when we were studying Winter Origins. Somewhere in the middle of the text, I had a dream, and in the dream, I was then looking at lighting fixtures in a store in the basement. These were all bargains. And I heard two women, young women, discussing the movie Inception. Remember Inception? Which is about a fabricated movie about lucid dreaming. So they're talking about Inception. They're also talking about Jung. And I couldn't help but be fascinated by this. But I was walking up a stairway, and coming down was the figure of Jean Gebser. And he said, you need to start listening with your third ear. And I woke up sort of puzzled and delighted by that. But last night, I think I did. I was listening to my third ear, with my third ear. I woke up in the middle of the night, and I had there was someone in the court. I have a courtyard, hundreds of people, of course, share apartments near me. But there was a noise that came from, they were watching TV or they were listening to something on their computer, but it was a really tinny sound, which produced in me enormous agitation. And then all of a sudden, and I know we worked with sound in the last gathering we had, Jeremy, in New York. That was that we talked a lot about sound and magic. And I also heard another sound in my environment, which was somewhere, I don't know where it was from, but it was a very soothing sound of it sounded like some kind of machine, but it was producing a soothing sound. And so I contrasted and compared the difference between the soothing sound and the agitational sound. And I realized there was a neutrality between these two sounds that I was embodying. I could feel certain places in my body that were soothed, certain places in my body which were agitated by these externally produced sounds. So I was wondering about, well, what's the difference between these two externally produced sounds and this sensorium that can hold both of them without flipping out into agitation or being soothed, but can hold them both. And then I had a dream. And in the dream, a beautiful woman came to me and she said, it was a very erotically charged moment. And I said, wait a minute, you have to understand something. I'm gay, okay? And you're a woman and I don't want you to be disappointed. And she said, but I'm not a woman. And I started laughing, and I started laughing so hard, I actually fell on the dream floor in sort of a fetal pose and started laughing, and she was laughing with me. But I think that's an example, sort of how you can hold the personal pronoun I, this is my theory here, holds together these various tempo rhythms and trance states, dream states, dissociated states, both traumatic and creative. And this helps us differentiate the new and the old, the relationships between the new and the old, and also laughter. I think when you're really having a belly laugh, it is often a sign for me of integration. You're integrating something extremely paradoxical. And it was very absurd, me telling this beautiful woman that I'm gay, and her telling me, but I'm not a woman. I said, well, what are you, girl? You're not a woman? Are you a man? Are you transhuman? Are you posthuman? And gay, straight, bi? What difference do all of those categories make anyway in this circumstance? So I realized I was bringing with me into this possibility all kinds of baggage. And that I found incredibly funny. So I hope someone else thinks that's funny too.
Yeah. So I think what I'm getting from what you're saying too is a good example of this. And it really is. Thank you for bringing that quote in. Most of that book was written in like a creative state anyway. And you know, sometimes I forget things that I wrote because the state of mind I was in when I wrote those things maybe got things a little bit better than my current state of mind, as happens. But yeah, I rather than make it a perplexing thing, I think we encounter this. I mean, this is sort of what Gebser's saying throughout Ever-Present Origin, that the nature of our being is capable of holding all of those things like you're describing. And I love the idea of the third ear, because again, you know, the magical and the aperspectival and the integral have such a beautiful resonance in the kind of the holism of magic and acoustics and auditory listening. And then the simultaneity in which Gebser describes the integral consciousness of there's a kind of a polyphony of different structures and different time-space expressions all like arising in this presence. And so there is this deeper sense in which that is a form of listening and of hearing, and a different form of kind of hearing the whole. And another word he uses is wearing, right? Of course. But these are all words until we have these kind of slippages where we end up kind of entering that state where the whole is apperceived. And I was thinking of Bonita Roy's podcast on Emerge recently, where she's talking about 5 ways of going meta. And what was so funny is most of them are kind of making their way along these very complicated philosophical, complex systems theory thinking, metacognitive thinking. And then right around the end, there was one of the, either the last one or the one before the last one, where she's talking about, it's this kind of feeling, it's kind of a sense, it's kind of this poetic embodiment. And in some sense, I think she mentioned basically saying that, like, well, this is the most important one because everything else follows from there. And I don't know, in some way, integral theory and all of this cognizing is a way to kind of come back to the present and to presence. We don't need any of those things in order to produce the integral of the aperspectival. It's just being very mental, abstracted beings is kind of how we come about it in a very roundabout way. So in terms of chasing the integral and the aperspectival, we don't really need to. I think, it happens in these slippages where we're least expecting it. And again, like we were saying in the last talk, it's more of an invitation to be more contemplative with our own sense of presence and consciousness, and not necessarily abstractive. I mean, Gebser even said that, in the end, everything is simple. That this is more so a poetic felt sense of presence that's intuitive and integral to our being that we can explore, rather than a complicated philosophy we have to come back around to, I think should be really emphasized as a way to kind of connect with it and try to find it. So I don't want to overcomplicate it, like in the end, everything is simple. So yeah.
Kind of like the underline, which you said right there at the end, Jeremy. The mental is primarily visual, and the magic is primarily auditory, and there's all these images and this rhythmicity in the mythical, but it's the felt sense and that's what we've been taught. Our upbringing, our schooling, all that I've gone through, we're taught to distrust that. You got to know, you got to figure it out, you have to be able to get a handle, you have to be able to explain, you have to be able to put it into words. But we have these feelings all the time. Intuition is a feeling. It's nothing other than a feeling. It can manifest as an image, as a picture, as a sound, but it's first and foremost a feeling. And we need to simply, and I think this is the simple part of it, we need to simply start acknowledging, recognizing, engaging, and reflecting in a good sense and a contemplating type way on our feelings, what we're feeling at the particular moment. Because it's just, how many times have we been somewhere doing something, go, this just doesn't feel right? Well, that's a pretty good sign that maybe you ought to stop doing it. Every time that I violated that and said, how bad can it be? It's been bad. Okay. We have to learn to trust that, because and that's part of this rediscovery, this resuscitating, this reactivating what was probably perfectly natural for magical humanity. We have to start trusting that again. And trust is a big issue. You even brought that up. That's one of the sections of your chapter 6 is on trust, and trusting our feelings is probably one of the most important primary things that we can do, because above and beyond everything else, it forces us to slow down. Because the moment I feel something and I don't know why, and I haven't got an explanation, the head's not, stop for a moment, take a deep breath, what's going on here? And it's amazing how quickly that can all happen. I had an experience once. I was driving to work when I was living in Silicon Valley, and I had 18 stoplights that I had to go through to get to my workplace. And I left very early in the morning. And of course, it was always my commuter's dream to get the green wave, and just, every light was green, and, and you could go through it. Well, I was on the third light going down, the main street from where I was living at the time. And there's this beautiful green light right next to the post office. And it came across, first I had this feeling, and then a little voice said, stop. And I go, well, okay, well, I learned a long time ago, when it finally gets that loud and it comes up to stop, I simply put on the brakes. And coming up to a green light, I put on the brakes. Now there's not a lot of people following me at 5 o'clock in the morning, I can tell you. And I go to stop, and this pickup truck literally flies through the intersection. Came from left to right, just flew through the intersection. It must have been going 60 miles an hour. Didn't even slow down for the red light, just went right on through. Okay, thank you. It's a red light, I'll wait, We can have the green wave tomorrow, because at least I'll be here to see if there's going to be a green wave. And it's these moments where normally you go, well, what's that? Who's telling me to stop? Where does the voice come from? But it's that sense that we get. This is what I hear John saying. Well, this happens to him a lot in his dreams. Okay, and every once in a while, for the rest of us who we don't get all of that in our dreams. Sometimes it shows up in real life, and it's very hard to do. It took me a long time to figure out. I don't know who's telling me this or who's talking, but he's a pretty clever individual. And so I think, or she or it or whatever it is, so I'm going to listen. And so once you start doing that and incorporating that into your everyday behavior, it hasn't eliminated all the problems of my life, and it certainly hasn't brought on the age of enlightenment and, everything is not grand, but I tend to end up with fewer bumps and bruises as a result. And I think both psychologically and physically. And I think that's probably an added advantage, and I've been trying to cultivate that more as I go along, which is why I appreciate when John can describe how this works in other realms where perhaps I'm not as familiar with that, so that when I encounter those kinds of situations that does pop up, I'm not as perplexed as I would be, which is the value of sharing what we do in these kind of situations. I just wanted to throw that in.
I just want to piggyback on what Ed says from a perspective of, I forget who the author is, John probably knows him. He wrote a book about with trauma, there's a convergence of body and mind. It disrupts everything. But if you go into it and you work with it, just adding on to what Ed says, what happens, I think, is you're just forced into reworking how you've been conditioned not to listen to that voice, not to trust it. And that's scary because, you're in this tension of needing to trust, but your whole system has collapsed and you feel helpless and trying to, where the fuck do I go now? And that's why I feel contemplative practices put you right in there, from the beginning, put you right there. And then from continued practice, you get to where Ed said that, I'm a rough estimate, I'm 65% more, I have 65% more ability, just to ratioize it, to listen, or if I have an interpretation, pause and going, how accurate is that? It could be, not just, in other words, slow down the reactivity of the mental rational trying to interpret what the voice is saying so quickly. And in order to do that from a person that's engaged, that's had trauma, it's real interesting that you have to go back into the body because you've been told through society and you've been given messages that the body is just a fucking machine and it has to depend on all these external sources, when in reality it's more like a plant or an animal. It favors that, it's organic. So I'm just piggybacking on what Ed said, because in this critical sense that I do think that there's a period to get back to trust. You have to challenge how you interpret your feelings. Here again, hermeneutics, because we have programmed conditioning interpretation. When I feel anxiety, if you're raised in in the Gaza Strip, you know, you're going to have, you know, you're going to have a certain interpretation when you hear a bomb go off that, you know, you need to listen to. So I just adding to what Ed said.
Doug, you want to go?
Sure, I'll chime in. There's a lot that's been said just recently, and I guess I'll start with a book by Jennifer Dumpert called Liminal Dreaming that came out recently this year. And I just had a chance to read it, and she does a great job of tying in this term liminal, this space in between, with dreaming, with the hypnagogic, hypnopompic states, but don't really need to know much about that. But it's kind of a hub of various explorations that we've done here, and I'm sure you've done too, Jeremy, with she talks about Corbin and Lockman and the imaginal realm. She also talks about Jung and active imagination, along with Yoga Nidra. It's a very good introduction to the various liminal states that we're sort of touching on here. So even someone like Ed, who doesn't dream, or doesn't remember his dream, doesn't do dream work perhaps, he still can tap into that sense feeling, this strange space that, well, Michael just said, we're much more than machine, that we're more like an animal, more like something in nature. But even beyond that, we're more than that. We're something beyond what we're able to describe. And it's been attempted by many, many people. Like you, Michael, you brought up Damasio and homeostasis, kind of going back to the roots, and how self came to mind as another one of his books from that very point up to where we are now. And as I read more and more into individuals, morphic resonance is another idea from Rupert Sheldrake that fits into this category that's often neglected. But something that Jennifer Dumpert is saying, that it's okay to have these ideas, just like Jeffrey Kripal in The Flip says, it's okay to be on the other side. You're not going to go off the deep end. You're not going to be in a psychotic state at all times. There are times when perhaps you need to hone it back in, but to remain in that critical pedagogical state of just not wishing to give credit to this unknown realm. She really takes this liminal space, and she says it's not a belief system, it's not a new systematic ontology or theology or whatever. It's this felt senses we're talking about. It's just a new, not necessarily a new realm. It's tapping back into those, like we're saying, the magical, the mythical realm, but bringing it into contemporary times, and not getting tied down to one belief, or not thinking you're a shaman or whatever it might be. So it can be fun to dive into science fiction while at the same time realizing here we are now. So I found that book very useful to think about how this creative state can be utilized. But dreams are very important, the imaginal realm, and that also takes us into Jung and his active imagination. Synchronicity was one of his concepts. So yeah, I'd really like to see how this conference that's coming up ties in a lot of these themes.
Yeah, me too, Doug. I'm hoping some people bring in the dream stuff. Yeah, that's. I like where you're going with this, and it made me think of what Gebser says even about corresponding the structures of consciousness with these different states of waking and dreaming and deep sleep. And one of the things that he describes is that the archaic has a kind of a resonance with deep dreamless sleep, right? There's a kind of a maximum latency, but then he's also comparing the archaic with the integral and saying that, you know, the integral is the fully exfoliated innate integrality of the archaic. So I'm always thinking, and this comes up in conversations with the Gebser Society too, about Tibetan dream yoga, and how in that practice you're supposed to kind of attain this lucidity as you move from both deep dreamless sleep into dreaming into wakefulness, and that the kind of lucidity is not equanimous or not equatable to waking consciousness. It's not that you're awake while you're going to sleep. There's this other kind of awareness that's been kind of actualized or sort of brought forth in clarity that goes through all of these different states of consciousness. So like at perhaps the most profound level, the integral then is this kind of lucidity. And I think Gebser even uses that somewhere in one of his descriptions, lucidity or clarity instead of mere wakefulness is one of the descriptions. So, you know, as a kind of a personal endeavor, I think we can navigate or circumnavigate around this and talk about different states of consciousness, and then also how all of these different states have this kind of awareness or clarity or lucidity that's sort of behind all of them, that's responsible for producing all of them in this sort of innate creativity, which brings them all forth. And the key, I think, to integrality in this sense is that it's consciously realizing that sort of creative ground which everything is springing forth. It's sort of just bringing that to the forefront of our wakeful or dreaming consciousness. And that sounds very difficult, and this sounds like some kind of yoga practice at this point. And maybe it is. Maybe in this deeper spiritual sense it is. I think it's sort of a mix of things, right? This is how we might personally attain this. This is how we might personally practice as a contemplative approach. Throughout EPO, as I mentioned in our last chat, he's always talking about cultivating clarity, not kind of getting carried away in the magic and the mythic, but just like sort of allowing it to be. And the only way you can do that is not to favor the mental over it. And the only way you can do that is to kind of get into the sense of presence and the sort of open spaciousness that's sort of, for lack of a better word, sort of at the bottom of everything that's emerging in human consciousness. So it's a deeply contemplative work if we think about it at the personal level. And maybe it's a little bit more, on the one hand, this sounds like something that only mystics and ascetics might achieve. But on the other hand, you know, what's nice about what's happened since Gebser's time is that so many of these practices are available to us, like you're talking about in that book. So, you know, we can begin to cultivate them. And then was it you or Mike who was mentioning hermeneutics? It was Michael. I think this is important in terms of a lot of these practices are contextualized as like, oh, here's these spiritual traditions that teach us how to get in touch with the ground of being. And Wilbur and a lot of these folks in the contemporary have kind of cleaved the contemplative insights from the world of time and politics and becoming and history. And to me, this is very antithetical to what not only the teachings are saying, but also what Gebser's saying, that you know, no, there's a diaphany that history is being weared through, and that this realization is being achieved in and through time, that time is not being negated. We're not going back to some primordial timeless state and disconnecting from everything that we are becoming, but it's here too. So that is just kind of looping back now to the macro, but anyway.
Okay, Jeremy, you just triggered a mythological image from today's world of Star Wars, when she goes down that black hole, you know, and into down inside. It's just like when you were describing that, I was thinking of how, on a sense, in contemplative, you allow yourself, space becomes dark before the light or the edge of light and darkness. I don't know if I'm making sense, but which, you know, just that she did what Luke Skywalker couldn't do, turn into the darkness, you know, dive in. And that, and, you know, it's been said that was like, you know, a vagina that she jumped into, you know, and then she's down inside of it, and then she's looking at her. Well, in that sense, it's a sequential time of mirrors, back and forth. So, you know, the way you were talking and stuff, it just triggered that kind of modern day film story that we're saturated with, that affects us along this line. the media.
I had a comment on that. I was going to say it anyway, and then you jumped in, Michael, but it relates to what you said. So,
Okay.
So one of the interesting things that Arthur Wendt talks about in his book, which I really liked, and I've been thinking about a lot, this is the book on quantum mind and social science, I think, is that light, so as one moves in space and accelerates in space and gets closer to the speed of light, your sense of time slows down. It's called time dilation. It's a proven part of physics, right? So the point that he makes is that if you are sitting on a photon of light, no time moves. So if you take the perspective, so even though the light travels these very large distances and it takes a long time from our point of view, from the point of view of the light, no time ever occurs. Everything is always happening at the same time. So we just have some photons and time freedom is there.
Yeah, that actually
Anyway,
sounds like
kind of
Dogen's
crazy idea, but
time. It sounds like Dogen's being time.
Yeah, I recommend that if anybody hasn't read that. Not that it's any more clarifying than Gebser, but being time is a great essay. Yeah, just a couple things to riff on here. The first would be, Mike, you mentioned the was it? It was the second Star Wars movie, right? The Last Jedi.
The very last one where isn't that where she?
Yeah.
She,
yeah.
It was
yeah,
an initiation. She initiated herself in a sense.
I like. So Thompson talks a little bit about Taoism in the womb and kind of the ancient matriarchal societies, and I love the ending of Coming Into Being because he sort of frames the future as a return to Taoism, as like the road not taken for civilization, and I love that. A lot of the language that Gebser uses for the integral is very Taoist in this sense. Like I have it pasted up here, from decline and participation. Action is replaced by poise. There's a kind of a action and inaction, right? There's this kind of poiseness and openness. There's this sort of, as you mentioned, going into the darkness, but the darkness is kind of this abyss before, like the cloud of unknowing, in that it's a full darkness, and that the void is full and brimming with potential and creativity. It's a luminous void. So I think there's many connections here with what Gebser's saying, that the nature of a perspectivity and then this sort of luminous void, and that's sort of fecundate with possibilities. And I think in the chapter on creativity, he even ties it into Taoism in the I Ching with Wilhelm Reich, right? Just when talking about the nature of origin and how it's connected to what the I Ching is talking about, it's connected to the Tao. So origin and the Tao and presence, and these are all, we have so much literature from the mythical, mental, whatever you want to call it, structures, that seems to be also talking about this. And kind of coming back to what John is saying, if we now with what Gebser was talking about in mind, go into these texts, go into these contemplative writings, I think we're going to read something very interesting here that we may not have made the connection with before. That's my only point. Just Taoism, the void, the womb, and origin. And again, integral is just the realization of that creative ursprung in the human being, right? The conscious realization of that in us at the most mystical, contemplative level. It's the realization of origin in the human being, just consciously actualized. And it's funny, he never says it's like. He's always talking about it as something with. It's a very symbiotic description. It's always like it's not before time. It's not after time. It's kind of like sidereal to time. And it's with us. It's adjacent with us. And then when integrality is sort of the kind of this actualization of that withness. But yeah.
So this, did you want to go, John?
No, go, Michael.
This kind of ties into a theme that we were talking about, reading in the body, and how, rereading these texts, and how, now I'm just putting it in my experience, because reading has done to me, how reading challenges my mental rational structure I've been at different points. You know, the way I've thrown myself into reading and having the, listening to somebody's language and how they structure certain thoughts and stuff has been an act that has helped me, along with other things, to actually get unstuck out of my own, in this particular incident, very intense stuckness when I was traumatized.
Thank you, Michael. I just want, is that me? That distortion? Oh, okay. There's so much going on here, and I'm only going to probably capture a little bit of what's being explored. But it's great that we can review this when it gets posted, and we can, I always am amazed at how much I miss during these conversations, because you're in the moment and you don't know where exactly it's going to go, but then you can look at the event in the archive, and now you can contemplate the different patterns that you missed in the moment. And I think that's what's so exciting about this technology, that we're using it this way. But as you were quoting Timothy Morton, he says in some passage I thought was really interesting that there isn't a void, it's a plenum. There's always activity going on. And it's very intense. And talking about phase spaces and the actual and the possible and the different logics that apply in an actual and in a possible, in the in-between, what gets concretized? A beginning, a before, a during, and an after. There is a sequence. And you can't be intelligible at all unless you can share before, during, and after with your fellow participants in a particular cultural framework with certain language games you're employing. But the phase spaces that we all can go into in fiction and art and drama and dreams, those are possibility spaces that have different kinds of logics. And they don't necessarily have deal with an excluded middle, you know, like we do in these, the physical spaces where we try to exclude. And identification is all about what is excluded. And I think in maintaining those identifications, that's where I think we get these convoluted, these logics that are happening are really, really important for some researchers like Stuart Kauffman. He's a great systems theorist. But I'm just using that as a sort of, to really focus about the daytime. The daylight mind, you say, looks with both superstition and temptation at the siren songs of dreaming phantasmagoria. So I think there's something about that supra-wakeful clarity that maybe is what diaphaneity or transparency is, where you can look at different states that the biological organism goes through, not just the human, but other than human. Organisms are going through sleep and wake and dream as well. If you've ever watched a dog take a nap, you'll see them go, and their tails will switch and their skin will get tight. And so they go into dreams just as we do. So I think Timothy Morton, and who I think you mentioned as a perspectival thinker, he has a daylight mind for sure, but I think he's very happy and comfortable with these nocturnal kind of spaces, where these alternative tempo rhythms, which are not necessarily human, can be engaged with. But I don't think you can bring back much without a personal pronoun I. And this, I think, is brought about by the magnificent mental structure, because we have a personal pronoun I that I believe at its best can make these subtle differentiations between these different phase spaces. And that is where I believe, and I believe that Jeremy is trying to flesh this out, the future, a future people, they probably will not speak Chinese or English or French or Italian, but we have access to the interiors of these future peoples. And I think this is what some quantum poetics is about, or the quantum mind that I think Vint is talking about. There's something, not teleology as a final ending, but teleology as a attractor that can bypass a lot of our, daylight, savings time kind of mental structuring, and which is very monophasic. It recognizes only one phase as real, into something that's more polyphasic. And I think that coordination of the mono and the polyphasic is what we're going through right now. And, and it isn't always pretty, and it isn't always pleasant. And I believe that a lot of us will numb ourselves with shopping or Xanax or some sort of psychoactive solution. And I think that's a tragedy, because a lot of what may be coming through, certainly may be coming through many different kinds of body. And this is my problem with Michael. You talk about the body. And I'm saying, I just want to hold a question mark around that. A body. There's a consortium, I believe, a consortium of intelligences that we can engage with, and they all have a body, but it's a different kind of body. And I think that's why it's so important for us to maintain congruence and coherence when we enter into these spaces. Out of all those possibilities, what gets concretized will be, I think, based upon the interplay of many different kinds of eyes, personal pronoun eyes. And a cat can have an eye, you and I as humans can have eyes, and who knows what doesn't have a personal pronoun I operating. They may not use language, but they can still be operating out of that. I think this is what I'm getting so much from Timothy Morton and his whole idea about the symbiotic self. So anyway, I'm just sharing this. I think we've opened up a lot of possibilities for future research together. And this has been incredibly stimulating. And I think we have about 5 minutes left if we don't go over. I just want to let everyone know how much I've enjoyed this, the aesthetic relationships that we're all emerging. And we're asking, I hope, more questions than we are getting answers. I think that's a good sign.
Just want to second that, John. I wanted to just quote one thing from Jeff Vandermeer, actually, little book called Strange Bird, The Strange Bird. It's in the Born series. There's 3 books now, Born, Strange Bird, and he's got another one coming out in December called Dead Astronauts. And they all have to do with these images that kind of emerge in the creative process for him. But there was one advertisement that I loved because it seems to be saying this in itself, and I can link to the actual image. But the image is this kind of multifaceted bird, right? I mean, the character of Strange Bird, I don't want to give too many spoilers, but it's, to hint at it, its nature is plural. It seems to be many different things. And the banner, the promo banner, which is just, being thrown up everywhere, was like, for what are bodies? Where do they end and where do they begin? And why must they be constant? Why must they be strong? It's a line from the book. There's so many questions and sort of just unanswerable inquiries that are just placed throughout so much of Vandermeer's writings, which is why I think Vandermeer and Morton work so well together and they like each other's writing so much, because they seem to be kind of playing with the same insight about the plurality of the I, even in ourselves, which is the interesting thing here. If we look at biology, this is the same question that's happening. The plurality of what it means to be a human being and the microbiome of our gut. There's more non-human life than human life in a single human organism, which is just in terms of biomass. There's more non-human matter to us. So it's this kind of non-humaning of the human, the sort of outering of this perspectival self, which once achieved has been, Aftab Omar always calls it the glory of the mental, is this self-sense. And Richard Tarnas talks about this too, the great achievements of Western consciousness and modernity and the separate self-sense that all this wonderful philosophizing has achieved in abstraction shouldn't be undone. And yet, I think part of what it means to enter the Perspectival is this diaphanizing of those walls and those membranes between the self and the other. You know, maybe the Cartesian dualism is an illusion, but we're not just going to undo the self. You know, it becomes, Cartesian dualism becomes uncanny. It becomes a strange, uncanny valley between the self and the other, where there's a little bit of blurring and permeability that's taking place. And I think so much of the literature today that interests me is playing with that boundary and exploring what it means to be a plural self, and to have a kind of a diaphanous sense of self and other. So yeah, I'm just really happy to explore this with you guys. Another one is, might be a good book to read together, is Staying with the Trouble by Donna Haraway. Again, just right on point with all of these themes. You know, she brings a lot from Margulis, Lynn Margulis as well, and her work on the symbiosis of the organism and how that was so crucial to evolution. And I was thinking, John, a few times of mentioning that, as you mentioned, the punctuated equilibrium, because that's her argument, that these leaps occur when there is a cooperative act of creative symbiosis between different organisms. And that's really helped achieve the major evolutionary leaps in the history of life. And so it is very resonant with Gebser's themes of mutation. So anyway, I'm really enjoying this conversation too. We could easily go over, but we'll probably save this for a future conversation.
I hope we will reschedule in the future a bit like this. Once I finished your book, I think I'll have much better questions than I have had today, but this is sort of an improv, so I've really enjoyed what we have covered today. It's amazing.
Although I wonder if we've actually solved anything.
I certainly hope not.
I don't know.
I think we'll solve it after your presentation of the quantum mind next week. We'll summarize after that one.
Okay, just raise the bar, John. Raise the bar. No, I think it's a good thing that we're asking questions. Picasso's noted for his quip that who needs computers? They can only give you answers. They can't ask questions, and it is in the questions. And once you get to, I don't know how it is with you folks, but if you ask yourself these questions, I got to find out what this is about. I have to get an answer to this question. When you do, it's such a letdown. At least for me, it's like part of it's just, okay, well, I got to the end of this. I need a new quest. But the other part of it is sometimes the answer is more mundane than the question led you to believe that it was. There are other times when you get to the end of it and you realize all this does is open up a whole new box of questions that we have to, that you pursue, and then you go off in those directions as well. And that's what I kind of like about these conversations, is there's a lot of points that are raised, and there's a lot of comments that are made that are very stimulating for thinking about things and generating new questions. And at the same time, do help to clarify some of the questions that had been there before about how do we deal with these things, what is it that we're talking about, like Jeffrey's encapsulation of, okay, so what the hell is this time thing that he's talking about? Well, we still need to work on that one. But I see that's where the real value, and for me, well, that's the value for me in participating here. So I'm very appreciative of what we're able to accomplish. I'm appreciative of what we were able to not accomplish this evening.
So I'd just like to say that it's always a pleasure to be in the presence of such strange birds. So we have Gebser as maybe the beautiful bird singing this language that not many people recognize. And it does take a certain strangeness. We don't have to be too far out there, but we are right here. So that's saying something. It's not just one of us tweeting to ourselves these great stories. We're all right here trying to figure it out together. And I think Gebser, though we present him as this giant that maybe we're standing on his shoulder, I think he would rather have us be little birds on his shoulder, or he would rather be the little bird tweeting in our ears. So that's what I took away from this conversation. Thank you all.
Thanks, Doug. As Rilke says, live the questions, right? So right. I think we're doing pretty good with that.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. thanks so much. This was very enlivening and helped me understand in a deeper, broader way about the influence of Gebser in this time, because that's what I'm trying. That's why I'm here, because I want to understand that.
Great. Any last words? No? Until next time, goodbye, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you all.
Bye. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Take care.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.